Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Tales and Tactics, Tales of Lore, the show where we journey through stories, settings, and genres that shape the worlds we play in today, and other things, of course. I am your host, Max, and joining me, of course, is my co-host, Troy, and doing his thing behind the scenes is our producer, Jay. Today's episode is the golden age of science fiction. Basically, this is where all of our concepts of modern sci-fi start. It's certainly not the origin point, but it is the high watermark by which most sci-fi that we think of today is either a reflection of or response to that body of literature and its associated subgenres. Let's wheel it back to the very beginning.
Yeah, let's take a look at the start.
So where does science fiction come from? Well, there's a lot of early ideas of speculative concepts, fantasies, elaborations on real concepts as taken to other ideas. Different cultures have travels to the moon sometimes or something to that effect. But I don't know that I classify any of those things as science fiction in the sense that we would understand it as the vein of literature in Western culture. That primarily starts with Mary Shelley and the writing of Frankenstein, which is also a horror story, and it gave a different view of what horror fiction in a romantic context would be, but we can talk about the origins of horror some other time. It has in it the fundamental science fictional concept, which is also sometimes a scary concept, which is what are the limits of technology, and not just the limits of like the physical limits of technology, but what are the ethical limits of technology? Jumping off of that, and we move further into the 19th century, we get Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and then you get H.G. Wells as well, stories like The Time Machine. Verne is much more of what we would, at least for his own time, we would kind of think of him as a hard science fiction writer, a lot more focused on the specific scientific workings of how does a submarine work and how do you travel to the moon. Apparently at the time it was with a big gun. Wells is more the socio-political ideas, or using, I don't want to call it allegory because they do function as stories, but using science fiction as a vehicle to describe political ideas or social ideas. And it's funny because those themes will continue to echo from that point on, even moving into the genre as we understand it today. And each of those will have its own moments in the sun, we'll say. The modern literary origins go to the early part of the 20th century. I suppose the first publication to specifically handle science fiction ideas, though I wouldn't call them that just yet, is in 1926, Hugo Gernsback, where we get the Hugo Award from,
right,
launches Amazing Stories and coins the term scientifiction. It's not the easiest thing to ramble off. Scientifiction is, I guess, an early form of modern science fiction that focuses a lot on gadgetry and invention, and is, I think, from what I understand, his motivation for having those stories and commissioning and editing that magazine was to inspire young people to become scientists and engineers. I don't know how successful that was, but it certainly got a lot of people interested in science fiction as a literary form. So if he failed to make scientists and engineers, he certainly made a lot of science fiction writers, because most of the people on our golden age list are probably people that read that magazine. But the genre doesn't start kind of really digging in there until the mid-30s. So that one of the distinguishing facts about, or distinguishing features, I should say, about Gernsback's view of science fiction is that they're not very good stories. I've even tried to kind of like read some of them, and they're just short stories, but they really aren't. Characters feel very, they feel like vehicles for explaining something. And if anyone's read science fiction that came later, but was still part of, like, near to that, you could almost accuse writers like Asimov for doing that from time to time. But if you read this stuff, it's pretty distinct. The characters are wooden is maybe a good description. They're not very fleshed out. But the next phase, and this is where we get into I guess we would refer to as the beginning of the Golden Age, is in 1937, John W. Campbell founds a magazine called Astounding Science Fiction. Actually, I think it went by a much longer name. It was, it had super science in the title. I won't dig around for that, but it eventually becomes known as Astounding Science Fiction or Astounding Stories. To give it some context, most of what was considered popular in the field of science fiction would be what we would call now pulp science fiction. These are stories by Edgar Rice Burroughs, so that would be the Barsoom sagas or the Barsoom stories, John Carter of Mars. Another notable example that I personally read is, this is an odd one because we typically think of him as a weird fiction writer or a fantasy fiction influence, but Clarke Ashton Smith wrote Red World of Polaris, which honestly is a bit of a thrilling read. It's old, but it's not really focused on, it's more focused on adventure, I think is how I would describe pulp science fiction. Troy, like, what is your take on pulp sci-fi?
I think pulp sci-fi, to put it in such terms, is it's more about the feeling it's conveying. It's more about the vibe than it is about any inkling about how anything works in a meaningful or concrete way. So you'll be confronted with like technology that allows you to travel vast distances or space and time and do things that are more just to like propose a scenario, less be something that you're considering as a piece of actual tech in a meaningful way. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like the tech is just a device. And I think that's what pulp uses it for.
I won't go as far as to say that it's just an aesthetic, but it's treated more thematically than in a specific or literal sense. It's not an exploration of that technology. That technology is more of a vehicle to the plot, or it's more of a plot device that allows for fantastical situations to happen. Some of the immediate descendants of pulp sci-fi would be Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers. Comic books definitely dig into this. I guess to some degree there are elements of Superman that fit this. Certainly the vision and operation, like the look and feel of Krypton in most stories is pulp sci-fi.
I would totally agree with that.
Yeah. Certainly as it's been interpreted, even looking back at it, that has become more concretized. The most famous modern version of pulp sci-fi is Star Wars.
Yes.
Flat out. It has more of an acknowledgement of some of the functions of its universe, but I think it's not particularly dependent on any of those elements working in a particular way in order to tell the kinds of stories that it's trying to say. It's more like heroic mythology in space, and I think most pulp sci-fi, if it's not that, then it's just adventure stories, but in a space setting. Now, considering that the proto version of what we would consider hard SF is just essentially a show and tell via narrative of some kind of gadget or concept. And then the inverse of that, or the other version of it, is spacefaring adventure with no consideration at how do those things work. In a lot of ways, what we think of as science fiction is kind of like a melding of those two ideas. And I don't know if anyone at the time has specifically said that, but I know that a lot of the writers that are considered to be part of the golden age of science fiction, they were definitely reading these things. Like, I know that Isaac Asimov was reading a lot of those Gernsback stories.
Much like you mentioned to me before, it's like you can see the later work reacting back. You see that here with the way the Golden Age is a reflection of the pulp works that preceded it.
Sure, yeah. And really taking the threads of that scientifiction, putting the juice of pulp into those stories so that it's grounded in a sort of real idea about what if? Because in a way, we're just talking about speculative fiction more generally. And I think speculative fiction excludes some forms of fantasy because they're not really based on the concept of what if. At least their stories are not dependent on that idea. I mean, you could say, what if magic?
Yes, okay.
Unless the point of the story is what if magic, and not just an element that is used to allow for certain things to happen, I don't really think of it as speculative fiction. I mean, I guess broadly speaking, you could say so. Some people use the term as a catch-all for, I guess, genre fiction that doesn't have a basis in reality. It's funny because genre fiction, though that term gets used to describe, typically science fiction, fantasy, and horror.
Yes.
It also includes other things like thrillers and intrigue stories, like military fiction. I always find genres to be very confusing. But what we think of as the golden age of science fiction is a lot of what comes out of Astounding Stories and then disseminates into a lot of other people writing science fiction and then a kind of popularization. It's weird because as much as we call this the golden age of science fiction, it doesn't really enter the public consciousness until a lot later. It's always running under the surface. And I think like some examples of it trying to like break the waterline, so to speak, are things like Stanley Kubrick's 2001.
Yes. Oh, Oliver, I'll shake my fist at you. That's my movie reference.
Right. So yeah, 2001 is, I guess, one of the first filmifications of a golden age of science fiction styled story. But people didn't really get it when it came out. Obviously, people who were into science fiction got it, and it was very popular, and it was obviously lauded by those people. And I would say that Kubrick went to the extent of most rigid science fiction authors by like consulting NASA. That might seem like a high level thing, but Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov knew people who worked in science and engineering and would ask them questions. I think Asimov even had something of like an engineering background. So they had connections to those people. And in the case of the subgenre of hard science fiction, which is very much focused on the functionings, I guess it's the closest to that early science fiction style where it's much more focused on the function of the thing rather than necessarily the tale being told.
Yes, agreed.
But the idea is that the characters and the story are more compelling. It doesn't feel like a slog to get through those. As much as if we go back and read them now, you're like, oh, wow, this is really dry. Like, well, we'll get into the specific authors and the books as we go forward. But you know what? I think maybe we can dig into that now. So like the big heads of that early era are, as stated before, Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, Robert A. Heinlein. Those are the ones that mainly get picked out, but there's a whole bunch of other writers. Like those are like the popular figureheads, but there's A.E. Van Vogt, Paul Anderson, who is somebody I mainly know for fantasy fiction.
Oh, interesting.
But yeah, definitely wrote science fiction. Who else? You jotted down a few.
Well, I have a couple really good ones, like Ray Bradbury from the 50s when he wrote the Martian Chronicles.
Oh, 100%.
And another one, Alfred Bester as well.
Oh, yeah.
That is sort of a little bit of a deep cut reference, but The Star's My Destination from 1956 has teleportation in it, as well as you could call it like an early influence on guys like the cyberpunk guys, who would later go on to define that whole genre in its own right, like William Gibson and the like.
Yeah, and then, I mean, there's so many authors. Harry Clement, who I guess at the time wrote Mission of Gravity. I mean, ones that I have direct experience. I mean, I'm curious what your direct experience is. For me, I've read most of the Foundation series. I actually found that easier to get into than the Asimov's robot stories. So that's Isaac Asimov.
Oh, yes. Okay.
So Asimov has a particular style of writing, which is very direct. and almost a little removed. And I think his characters sometimes suffer from being more servicing of the plot than strong characters in and of themselves. There are definitely exceptions to that. I think the difficulty I had with reading Asimov originally was his ideas are presented in the structure of the way he tells stories is often very ambitious.
Right.
So for those of you that don't know, Foundation is a story about the future history of a galactic empire and its rise and fall and the tracking of its progress, or sometimes it moves into like fundamentalist belief, or of something called psychohistory, which is effectively a formula for predicting the future down to these like pivotal events. And that sounds like a big idea as it is, but each installment of the narrative jumps ahead massively in time to the point that I guess it sacrifices some of the characterization because you don't really get to know any of the characters very well.
True.
Because by the time the next story starts, they're either really old or dead. I found that once I started getting into it and I started kind of relaxing my expectations about how a story is supposed to read, it actually read really well. And I was really enjoying it. In a lot of ways, it's that rare thing where the setting is the character and the characters are part of the setting.
I think that's what most big picture sci-fi is trying to feel like.
I think so. I don't know that I've ever seen it done to that level of ambition. I mean, I think Dune comes close. It approaches it in a really different way because Foundation very literally demonstrates the idea of deep time, whereas Dune feels like deep time.
Right. Interesting.
It's more of a thematic element and less of something that picks at the plot. It feels like the current running underneath the story, as opposed to the actual story. But yeah, you mentioned The Martian Chronicles.
Yep, by Bradbury. That's a wild one.
So yeah, Bradbury is really interesting. I think Bradbury really adds the element of style and almost poetic nuance. I often see him both in his repertoire and his approach as being kind of a descendant of O. Henry, with the sort of like short, sort of snap together stories that have those really stinger endings.
Oh.
With more of a bent towards speculation rather than, the guy that, I don't remember how that classic story goes, but it's a couple that try to buy gifts for each other and the woman like cuts off her hair and her husband buys her combs.
Yes, of course.
Right. So that's like your O. Henry, like ironic twist ending.
Yeah, of course.
And a lot of Bradbury has that feel, and it almost brings like a pulp sensibility with that snap ending. But Martian Chronicles, I found that to be very like paced and moody almost in a lot of ways. I don't know if you've read it.
Most of my Golden Age reading is Heinlein. So that's where a lot more of my background comes from. You remember what's the Heinlein anthology series of short stories? Do you recall the one, something about the moon or something?
Oh, yeah.
And it's great. That was like bedtime reading in my house growing up as a child. So
nice.
I got exposed to Heinlein young, and I really digested a lot of that growing up. And that's probably why I still like a lot of military sci-fi when I read that, because I read a lot of Heinlein. It's
funny because Heinlein, we think of him obviously for something like Starship Troopers, but a large body of his early work are basically Boy Scout stories in space.
Yeah, so, that's true.
I guess the best of these is Have Spacesuit Will Travel.
Yeah, great.
Which is a really fun story, though it's very set in it. It feels anachronistic to read it now. And I don't just mean in tone. I just mean in like the almost the way the world feels. It's very optimistic. And that's partly why I like it. I like the throwbacky, quirky, I don't get this because it doesn't fit into the reality that I live in, but it's an interesting window into somebody else's speculation of the future.
Yeah.
The short version of that story is kid wins a spacesuit in a contest and then goes on fun adventures in space, some of which are vaguely life-threatening, but he makes it out all right. In the
Spaceman
end.
Spiffed.
Yeah. But like The Moon is a Harsh Mistress is another great story, which is libertarian revolt on the moon.
Is that the one where they have the like the air vents and they fly around in them?
The main part of that one is essentially the moon people are tired of taking the crap of the people on Earth, and they basically create a kinetic slingshot to shoot boulders at the Earth as a way of like rebelling.
Oh, wow.
It's basically like American Revolution, but on the moon.
Right.
A bit of a weird summation, but it also becomes a kind of, I don't want to call it a political tract, not in the way that Starship Troopers sometimes feels like, or is sometimes quite obviously.
Yes.
But
Well said.
More in the sense that it does have a very particular political view and a statement about freedom and feeling connected or not connected to a historical founding. It's a good read. It's certainly interesting. I'm trying to think of like the element that Heinlein brings to it. I guess there's a kind of pragmatism, and there's a political richness and a lived-in feel.
Yes.
It's very like boots on the ground kind of science fiction in the way that like Asimov has lofty concepts, and Heinlein's worlds feel more real in some sense. And they play on a lot of ideas of like civic duty and social structure. Obviously, Starship Troopers is like a very direct view of that. But
Yes.
Usually the motivations are very social and very practical. Then there's Arthur C. Clarke, who, I mean, if we're talking about origins of 2001, then there you have it.
Well, indeed.
But I guess Childhood's End, and which I haven't read, but the story that I know is Rama and Rama 2.
Right.
I guess the thing that Clarke brings is a sense of mystery and wonder. He's really good at conveying the idea of the unknown as something other than horror.
Yeah.
Because Rama is basically about a alien ship that just shows up. I honestly think it's kind of the blueprint for every Warhammer 40K Space Hulk concept. Except that's more of a nightmare fueled experience. Rama is more about exploring this strange ship and trying to figure out what's going on. Or I think the first one is about the ship just showing up. And then Rama 2 is more about the exploration and origins of that vessel. A lot of Clarke stuff is like almost, especially the later stuff, is almost spiritual, or it has a very complex moral dimension to it.
Well, I mean, Childhood's End is a very complex perspective on like, what does it take to reach a new level, right? Like, what is the cost of a utopic society? Because seemingly it could be good, but then there's so many complications that get explored. And you know what I mean? Like, what is it like to leave behind humanity, as a result of this? And what are part of those definitions that we rely on? And that's early 50s stuff. That's not even like a lot of what we're thinking in our mind's eye might project this as more like, oh, wow, yeah, this was I guess I'm just speaking of my own experience, but I perceived much of what was pioneering in sci-fi as happening around the same time as fantasy went through its period. But to see it like 20, 30 years ahead of the curve is very fascinating. Just even in the language that's used in the storytelling is different. So it kind of has a different feel altogether.
Yeah. Well, as I said, like the genre was very popular within its own dimension, and like things like 2001 Space Odyssey and Star Trek, like the original series.
Yes.
Trying to think of some other early precursors, but like those are the only points where the genre really breaks above the surface of public consciousness. And you're right, it's like it almost seems as though sci-fi and fantasy kick off at the same time, but science fiction has been, well, I mean, we also pointed out that fantasy was kind of brewing in the background in some proto form.
Truth.
But the main difference between them is that in the 50s, well, sorry, I guess the 40s and 50s, and coming off of the 30s to 50s. We'll be generous. And even, actually, hell, you argue with some people even into the early 60s. Hedging. The genre crystallizes in a way where everything after it is some kind of response to it. And so there's at least 3 authors that I think of as being kind of a reaction to it. But it's interesting because, so I'm thinking of mid-60s authors and their reaction. So we're Philip K. Dick.
Yeah, that's the first one.
Harry Harrison, and Brian Aldiss. And Brian Aldiss is a connection to, I guess, what is sometimes called the British or European New Wave that comes in more the mid-60s. It doesn't really kick off until the 70s, but it shifts the idea from being around science fictional concepts as concepts and then turns it more to how it affects people in society, which we had already seen because Clarke and Heinlein touch into that. I mean, even Asimov, if you think about some of the robot stories, are very emotionally driven ideas about identity,
right,
and what it means to be human. I actually feel that Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is almost a continuation of the idea from those robot stories, except in this case we're talking about machines that are not machines in the way that robots are, but they more resemble human beings that we can empathize with and almost can't tell the difference. The reaction to that initial golden age is not immediately to question it, but to almost carry the ideas forward.
Yeah.
Right? We only start getting the cynical view when we get to the 70s, and mostly the late 70s, and definitely more into the 80s and the 90s.
Right, of course, yes.
That's when we start to see a lot more of a directly cynical view of the optimism that is in the Golden Age. So the Golden Age is, I mean, I don't know if you can really call these subgenres. They might be the roots of some of them. So I had mentioned hard science fiction, which is based in real physics, plausible tech, scientific accuracy. Hal Clement, or Harry Clement, the proper name, and Clarke and Asimov. I don't know that they hold super hard to this, but they definitely make the extra effort for plausibility. A lot of harder science fiction writers like Larry Niven.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Take influence. So Ringworld it's readable. It has a story, but it's really deep into the science part of it as well, which can make it a little impenetrable at points.
Right.
It's definitely, it's written to a particular audience, but Niven went above and beyond to explain gravitational physics. And I think that Clarke and Asimov would probably they probably did approve, or they thought it was an admirable effort of putting a lot of science into a story. Another genre or theme, I guess, is technocratic utopianism.
Yep.
Which it sounds naive or bad to think about it now, but Foundation and Starship Troopers definitely have this idea where it's almost a what if my ideas fixed the world?
Right.
From a very top-down view. Now, it's really funny because Heinlein particularly in other stories kind of undermines this. The Moon is a Harsh Mistress is obviously the colonists believe themselves to be right, but it's a very from the ground up kind of. Yeah, Heinlein's interesting. He's always throwing people off as to what he's about because he seems to be about a lot of things.
It's true.
I remember some anecdote about after him writing Stranger in a Strange Land, hippies would start camping out on his lawn and he chased them away with a shotgun because they only understood his ideas from his books. It's weird to think that the guy that wrote Starship Troopers is the same guy that wrote Stranger in a Strange Land, because the themes, if they have any connection together, it's entirely through their author and his musics, because they have almost nothing to do with each other.
That's very interesting.
But Stranger in a Strange Land is late enough that I don't think it really fits into the era that we're talking about specifically. But yeah, Brian Aldiss is really interesting an extension because he's more focused around the moral implications of technology. Again, one of the other descendants of the genre, Harry Harrison, is how do you add style and humor into that setting?
Right.
I think the story that he's most famous for is The Stainless Steel Rat, which is essentially a reprobate thief who is very likable, but clearly not a good person, going about a bunch of sort of capers and shenanigans over the course of several books. One in which I think he runs for president. Yeah, Harry Harrison's he's really fun to read. He has this really flashy kinetic style. He wrote what is probably the first parody of science fiction, which is Bill the Galactic Hero.
Oh.
And that predates Hitchhiker's Guide by so many years. But again, because science fiction is such a niche genre, only science fiction people really got the jokes. So it didn't, even though he was popular in other genres, maybe he didn't care if it only resonated. But he wrote several Bill the Galactic Hero stories, like novels. So I've read excerpts of them. They are pretty funny. But you do kind of have to know something about the tropes of science fiction as written in the 60s in order to kind of grasp the humor.
Right, of course.
I'm by no means of an expert. I have a friend who's read a lot more Golden Age science fiction, and I usually get books recommended to me by him. And I don't think I've gotten through half of the things that he's recommended. So what else do we get from this military science fiction?
That's a big extrapolation from Heinlein's works. And I mean, it's present in a lot of the other fiction in the era, right? Like it's part of it, especially in the empire management, empire building stuff, you know, not necessarily to say Asimov is a mill sci-fi by any estimation, but his, like, the thing he talked about inspired people to think, how would the military of that work? You know?
It's true. Yeah. I almost feel that, like, well, Foundation is kind of like the literary equivalent of a 4X game.
Yes, of course. That's really good.
And a lot of other writers kind of looked at the implications of warfare in space that are suggested by Foundation and then ran with that idea. That's an interesting connection. Because, yeah, I think he created such a compelling world that had all this turmoil and changes and phases to its development. It doesn't specifically dig into that at any one point. Well, I mean, from time to time. But military science fiction is a big foundation in games, obviously.
Oh, yeah, it's huge. Like, that's what propels wargaming in the sci-fi genre.
BattleTech is a mill sci-fi genre or setting.
Yeah, perfectly put. It is.
I know that some people will jump to say that 40K is, but that's actually science fantasy.
Yep, it is. Even Horus Heresy is.
Yep. Horus Heresy is maybe a bit more themed a little differently. It almost has a Golden Age sci-fi vibe.
It kind of does.
But it's not that.
It's more diesel punky in its way, which is, like, kind of cool, and I like it. But yeah, it's, again, doing its own thing, and I don't think its relationship to science fiction is beyond aesthetic, like we were saying earlier.
I think it draws more of its inspiration from pulp sci-fi.
Yeah.
It might draw from the scope of more classical science fiction works, but it's too rowdy. It's more focused on the victories and conquests and dramas that are happening in the setting to be focused on, like, how the warp works, or, well, I guess that doesn't really factor into it exactly at that point.
I mean, it's more of a wrestling storyline with, like, big personalities that continually re-meet and re-clash and forge different rivalries with each other. Like, it's basically that premise played out with action figures, which works really well for that audience for sure. And for me some of the time too, heck. But I would say, like, my favorite thing that I see in science fiction is the speculative question asking, the stuff that really makes good cyberpunk. You know, like where do we see our world getting to? And what are the considerations, like in some exaggerations present, some extrapolations for the purpose of narrative present, but what does it suggest about our nature, but the nature of what we are to become? And like fiction that is very modern, so it's not golden age sci-fi at all, but I really like The Dark Forest because it talks about space travel, but it talks about how the implications of traveling in such an environment impact the morality of the people making the travel, making the trip. And it's like they have to change their very nature of what they think is okay and acceptable and not acceptable to survive the rigors of space travel. And it's fascinating thought experiments. And those types of things, I think, are the best thing to come out of the golden age of sci-fi.
Like, it sounds like a direct reflection of, I think, what's called Niven's laws. So this Larry Niven wrote a series of laws. I'm trying to remember which one. Oh, yes. Law 9, ethics change with technology.
Oh, right. Yes. I think the line from the book is somewhat paraphrased to be, there is a new morality in space. And that's like a really good line.
Yeah, that's bombastic, but it definitely sells the point.
It's good. So yeah, and there's like, I don't know, I've read more like Herbert and more of the stuff that came after this period more directly. So a lot of my understanding of this period is in reflection and reading about these materials where I haven't firsthand read them. But I'm absolutely glad that stuff like the multi-series epic of Asimov's Foundation came to fruition, because we wouldn't have anything like a 40K without of having had that depiction of a galactic empire first.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I honestly feel that, yeah, as I said already, Dune itself is a direct extension of the concepts of Foundation.
Yeah, it goes like Foundation, Dune to 40K in sort of a cascade. I mean, it's not as simple as that, of course, but there is a certain progression of themes.
Yeah, and there's also that molding of military science fiction from Heinlein, Starship Troopers in particular. I still find the inspiration drawn from Starship Troopers to be so perplexing, because there is so little technical, and so much of it is just politics.
Yeah.
It's just characters talking to each other about the right and wrong way to run a society. And there's just these little snippets of like power armored soldiers nuking the hell out of aliens.
Yeah, 100%. It's a strange read.
And then how many people don't even know what Starship Troopers is about as a book?
Yes.
But they know those other ideas. They know like bug aliens, they know power armor, they know like personal sized tactical nukes. I mean, that one doesn't show up that often, but
like John Stakely's armor from like decades later in the 80s, like that's what they're thinking of. They're not thinking of Starship Troopers. So it's like, it's weird, but...
No, I know, yeah. Because that book it's not that much about warfare, even though it's about warfare.
No,
it is. It's about the necessity or the ethics of warfare, or how to beat an unbeatable enemy, or how to run a functional... It goes on some crazy tangents.
But it's also about like living as a soldier too. It's like a reflection of his own experiences as a crewman in the Navy, or as an officer, I should say. But it kind of speaks more to like when he's talking about the experiences of being aboard a ship. It's like, oh, this rings with a certain authenticity regarding his experiences aboard a ship when he served. And that is interesting and kind of gives it a perspective on some of the content. I don't know that all of Starship Troopers is exactly as like what you think it's going to be when you go to read it. You know what I mean? If you don't quite know what the material is, you may go in looking for something more exciting than you're going to find, perhaps.
I mean, there's some, like, the opening has got some...
That'll get your blood running.
Yeah, it's got some evocative, like, scene setting with the guy in the pod, and he can hear the other pods being, like, dropped in succession before his. And, like, the movements in the ship, and just the weird, like, He's good at painting a scene. I mean, even in Spacesuit Will Travel, he's really good at setting up the home life of the kid at the beginning and his obnoxious ambition to go into space. I think he's just a really good author, like whatever he writes about. But like that's true of Asimov. Clarke is really fun to read for that reason. I find Clarke maybe the most readable of any of them because there's this poignance I feel that he brings to the story that makes it feel like it matters. I'm not saying that the other that like Heinlein or Asimov don't do that, but it's almost like when I read their stories, I have to remember what the point of it is. Whereas I feel that Clarke is really good at being like, these are the stakes. This is what's going to happen if this thing doesn't, or even with longer stories or more drawn out stories.
This is kind of a sidetrack question here for you, but have you ever read something from this era, from the Golden Age, that you didn't connect with? Not to say that it was poor or had poor quality, but that you just didn't have that relationship with that you've had with some of the other fiction.
I think some of Asimov's stories, the robot stories, I liked I, Robot, though it's a weird story. Some of them, they run a range, and I can't remember which ones it were that I bounced off of, but I was trying to get into reading Asimov at the time. The one robot story that won me over was Bicentennial Man, because those are the ones that everybody recommends, right? They're like, oh, well, read that one. But then I read Foundation and Caves of Steel, and I was like, no, I like this better. I think it was just sort of recommendation in a lot of ways. Even though that stuff is drier, for some reason I connected with it better.
Right, okay.
Some of the robot stories are pretty dry too. I did like some of the more humanized ones, but it felt more like somebody trying to explore a concept in a story than trying to tell me a story, if that makes sense.
Yes. I didn't get into the robot books, but I did enjoy the first Foundation.
Oh, yeah.
And I will say that's about as much Asimov as I was willing to do at the time. It's just that it's like a certain personality of writing. And that certain personality is sort of colors the way the characters even work in the setting. You know, like the characters are like, it's best to it's really good reading. It's really thought provoking. The whole psychohistory concept.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot to gain from it. And especially weird going back to watch the show after having read it years ago. It was like, whoa, this is a different take.
Yeah, I haven't even done that.
It was so different that I'm like, okay, in my head, I'm just putting this as a different thing. Like, you're not even the same thing. You're a different thing. But yeah, that would be as much as I got into that. I always wanted to read the Bradburys and get into the Arthur C. Clarke. You know, that's always been something I wanted to do. But Philip K. Dick that was more where I spent my time reading, and William Gibson and more of that stuff.
Yeah, so we're talking about Silver Age and Dark Age. It's funny too, because I'm trying to think of my early science fictional stuff that I got into.
I think one of my first ones was Heir to the Empire by Timothy Zahn, one of the first Star Wars expanded universe novels, and that was like, whoa, books can be like movies. And then I was really into reading sci-fi. I just read a lot of sci-fi after that because I didn't know. I just would go to the library and I didn't know what any of it meant. Because it wasn't an era the same as it is now where everything is part of a franchise. So books were just books. You just didn't know what you were going to get. So you just grabbed a book. It looked cool. Maybe it sounded cool. And it could have been really bad, or it could have been a wild book. And that was a really fun time just to read. It was like this cool, just exploring the library, looking for stuff. I'm sure there's things I read that I have forgotten that might make certain lists of certain eras, you know? But it was very fun just getting to rip through sci-fi when I was young, just because of some of those early movies I watched that got me interested in the genre.
Yeah. No, totally. I get that. Yeah, I think the one series that I really dug into, and I have no idea why, because anyone I've recommended it to has always had a hard time, but Dune. And other Herbert books, actually, which really focus around the idea of intelligence and what it means to what is the value of intelligence. I honestly think Herbert should be more explored than just Dune, which is good, but a lot of his other books are really different.
I like that in an author too, where you get something very different from their different works. Like there is a conversation that's happening that isn't just the same conversation over a new setting or theme, you know? It's like, whoa, we're talking about something different foundationally here. I like that.
Yeah.
Even in the same series, I'm not opposed to that.
Yeah, of course. It's one of my favorite genres. And okay, so I have to ask you the classic question, which is, I think it was Clarke, which is, any sufficiently complex technology is indiscernible from magic. So the question is there a meaningful difference between fantasy and science fiction?
I've always liked this definition, and I don't know if it's from some random Reddit post from 10 years ago or if it's actually from some person who knows what they're talking about. But it was, science fiction is a way to explore ideas and societies, where fantasy is a way to explore feelings and emotions. And I always liked that as their distinction, less like the boundaries of laser swords, because they could both have laser swords. But it's more like, what is the speculative content of the material? And is that even a part of it? And if it's not asking questions about people, society, functioning in some capacity in life, then I think it's probably fantasy, because it's more wrapped up in more heady notions like feelings of life, death, love, value, things like that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I do think that, I guess, the thematic content is different. I think there is a difference in the technical aspect, but I think it has more to do with how those elements are handled and like what is the emphasis of them. I think that one thing that makes not necessarily a good science fiction setting, but a distinctive one, is when the technology has inbuilt limits that seem like reasonable extensions of the limits we have with our own technology.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for instance, if I get into a car, I can't fly to the moon, right? But fantasy is sometimes willing to break that. And some might argue that like having really strong rules for your fantasy elements is also a good idea. And I don't disagree. I think it's important to have at least an internally consistent system. I don't know if that's not necessary in fantasy, though. I think you can get away with... I think there's been really good fantasy fiction that has almost nebulous magical qualities.
Yes, agreed.
I don't feel you can really do that quite as well in science fiction. I know there's some exceptions. I know Moorcock does some weird stuff that borders on like absurdist science fiction.
Let's all form up into one giant guy. Spoiler alert, by the way, I guess.
Well, okay, yeah. So there's that particular Eternal Champion story that I'm like, oh, is this the Western fantasy equivalent of like a Voltron robot?
I love it. I don't know what else to say.
I was thinking more of Final Program because, well, that's more about like society and technically Jerry Cornelius is one of the Eternal Champions, so claimed. And he does cross over with other characters from those multiverses. But there's some interesting ideas about it's I think that's more like acid soak sci-fi and not so much like fantasy sci-fi. I think it's more of a matter of perspective and not so much a matter of concepts.
Yes, agreed. I like when my sci-fi though isn't afraid of using technology, but I hate it works like this. No, think of it like a balloon with a lighter under it. And you're like, oh, I get it now. Like that type of thing.
Oh, okay. The Star Trek,
like simile to solve the knowledge gap that the audience has to the problem solving.
Yeah.
But it completely belittles the problem in the way they describe it to such an extent that it just sucks all the drama out of it. That always kills me. And that's a soft sci-fi thing more so than like a hard sci-fi thing, to use those terms. But I'm not afraid of it being like, no, here's some numbers. Even if the numbers don't mean anything, they don't have to mean something. But if you give me numbers and I'm like, whoa, that looks real to me. Yeah, I bet, huh? You know?
Yeah, I mean, well, we know that Star Wars isn't science fiction in the traditional sense.
No, it's a fun blend of science fantasy. Like, there's lots of science fictional elements and even science, military, fantasy, sci-fi, sword fightery. But ultimately, it's way more fixated on myth, legend, and emotion than it is about anything to do with like how things work in a meaningful capacity.
There are explanations for that, but it's not really the case. The real question, though, is Star Trek science fiction?
If I want to make some really close friends, I'm going to say it's not, because...
Oh, okay. I don't know what friends you're catering to. I'm not saying that it is. I would, in fact, make that argument as well. I think it may have started out more firm, but yeah.
I think it's become a serialized television drama that has the trappings of science fiction. Kind of like, you know, how there's science fantasy, you know, it's almost like it's like kind of the same thing as Stargate is, where it's like, oh yeah, that's like a TV action show, but it has science fictional window dressing. And I feel like that's what Star Trek evolved into in our Paramount Plus era. And it's a little disappointing to me, because there were periods of time where Star Trek was way more introspective than it appears to be now, based on my more casual relationship I have with it, you know. And I don't just want to shout out only Deep Space Nine as the obvious great thing, but like there were times where there were really interesting conversations in Star Trek about like conflict, occupation, travel, exploration as a very thing that you can do on its own, right? Like all these things have been looked at, but I would say Star Trek has sort of forsaken that type of conversation to be more of a week to week, what do we leave you hanging on to bring you back to next week? And if it needs to be one of those simile style explanations of our technology, then that's what we'll do.
Yeah. I know that there, from the very beginning, have been people who have been trying to make that series more serious. Oddly enough, one of those people who it is not was Gene Roddenberry.
That's always been the funny thing to me. Like, Star Trek has always had a certain element of sobriety to it that has never been present in the Star Wars fan base. And it's like, it's funny that that's not really true of the creator's intent of the fiction. He had a little bit more of a...
He was more Wellesian in his storytelling.
Yeah.
He wanted to make a point. I don't know that he wasn't the most sophisticated person in some regards. To make a weird point to the fantasy episode, I agree with Tolkien. I don't really like allegory, at least when it's that on the nose.
Right.
And as much as people are like, oh, well, those are really like landmark episodes. Like, I've forgotten the name of the one, but the one with the people who have one half of their face is black and the other half is white. And then the minority are the ones where the sides are reversed. And I'm like, I'm sure there's a better way to tell that story.
The actor who plays the Riddler from that era's Batman is one of the leading men of that episode. So that
he nails that.
It's so funny.
It's kind of overacting a little bit.
I mean, that's the style though, right? You got to try to take that.
It's the vibe of the show. As long as it all works together, it's great.
Yes, I agree with you. And the allegorically heavy-handedness of the early Star Trek season, of the early Star Trek work in general, can be exhausting. When you get to Voyager, they just use the frickin' holodeck to solve all their problems, and it gets really annoying fast. But there's some really great stuff in there too. So I don't know that I want to call it science fiction, because it, like, and you may say, oh, what? It's totally speculative. It totally postulates on a new world.
Some of it does, yeah.
But my argument with it is how does it get to there? Oh, we just don't have scarcity now. How? Well, because we have replicators. Well, how do you have those? We were given them. It's like, oh, So so the fantasy starts to show itself now.
Yeah.
Because like the way that we reach this new speculative destination is not through any means that we are coming to through conclusion or reason or logic. We have an intervention, a magical intervention.
We are gifted replicators and light speed travel by space elves.
And it changes the way that we can interact and live our lives. And of course our society changes, but it's not a reflection on like how, space elves too, by the way, bang. But it's not a reflection on like how we as a culture or a people would change or would arrive at that through certain conditions. It's like, oh, if space elves came, we could totally be Star Trek. I know that like my own families are big Trek heads, so they're going to hate me for it. But like, that's what I think.
And like, again, that's why I think it's a lot more about it's more of that soft SF ramifications, even though there's totally explanations for how like warp bubbles and warp drive work and the principles of a lot of this stuff it's almost added on. Some of it's foundational, but a lot of it, and especially the extrapolation of it, is added on in the same way that the explanations for Star Wars are added on.
Like games and magazines and like supportive fiction out the yin yang that allowed you to speculate on all the additional material.
Yeah. And I think it goes to show that you don't need those things to tell a story and that the story is the thing that comes first.
Yeah.
But the fact about what makes technology different from magic is more a level of focus and emphasis.
Interesting. Yeah.
And also the idea about like, it's not just what it can do, but what it can't do.
Yes, the limitations that exist. Like when you said a car that can't fly to the moon, I was instantly struck by how that feels like a lot of modern science fiction, where it's like we get on our spaceship and we're at our destination now. And it's like, what travel, what traversal was even necessary to get there? And maybe that's not like prime screen time, but the fact that it doesn't exist in the canon of that fiction at all, it's like you might as well just be using jaunts, just teleporting all over the place then.
Yeah. And, some settings just kind of like get crazy with it. Like, as I said, 40K is a
good example of...
I remember seeing a meme that broke down the explanations of how each sci-fi setting or science fictional styled setting travels through space. And the last one was 40K, and it was like, we tear a hole into hell and then travel through it.
I like that.
And I'm like, and after all of these nuanced descriptions of how like warp bubbles are formed or space folding, it's like, nah, screw all that. It's just demons in hell space. And even in that case, the nuance is then filtered back in because there's the whole idea of like subjective reality in a different dimension that works with different rules, right? So somebody always wants to bring that hard SF toolkit into anything that's remotely space related. And I'd argue that if you look at really good fantasy fiction, some people bring that toolkit there too.
Yeah, they do.
Anyway, I think we've gone on enough about this, but it was fun chatting.
Yeah, no, that's really good. But we'll be back again with some new content. We're looking at a fan submission, so we're excited to talk more about that once we get a little closer to our episode date. But it'll be really exciting to give that a run through, play, and explore and experiment with. And other than that, it's been great having a sci-fi jam, much like our fantasy jam. This is just sort of a free-form conversation, so I hope you enjoyed. But otherwise, thanks so much for tuning in.
Yeah. All right. And for those of you that game, happy gaming.
Happy gaming.
We hope you enjoyed delving into today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast or on all popular podcast platforms. Join us again on the next exciting episode of Tales and Tactics.